Jessica Le Mazurier in the newsroom. Well, the day began with a credit rating agency downgrading Italian bonds. It continued with brutal numbers on world growth out of the IMF. Otherwise put, faced with the genuine threat of a return to recession, governments don't have the means to kickstart the economy. Well, they better think of something fast. Scenes like this one out of Greece have now become a daily occurrence. That's bad enough, but how about Italy, the Eurozone's third largest economy? And it's not just government bonds that are turning to junk. Siemens has emphatically denied a Financial Times report that it took cash out of Société Générale 2 weeks ago to keep it safe at the European Central Bank. The withdrawal, it insists, dates back to early July. Nonetheless, another brutal day for Soc Gen. At one point, it was down below 6% on the Paris stock market, finishing a little bit better, down 2.5% still. The point is, markets don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. If the Greeks do default, what happens afterwards? Not just in Athens, but in Europe and around the world. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the prospect of what happens when Greece goes under, with a man who's been advising Europe on monetary policy since the creation of the euro. Grand Bishop joins us from Battle in the southeastern English town where William the Conqueror prevailed. Thanks for being with us.
Good afternoon.
Also with us from Philadelphia, Sunny Kapoor, Managing Director of Redefine. Thanks for being with us again in the France 24 debate.
Thanks for having me.
And with us here in Paris, George Prevalakis, who teaches geopolitics at Paris's La Sorbonne University. Thank you for being with us. Philippe Vechter, Chief Economist for banking firm Natixis Asset Management, and Frédéric Bonnevet of the Fiscal Policy Forum. Welcome to all of you gentlemen. And by the way, thanks for your input on the France 24 debate Facebook page and on Twitter, where our handle is at François F24. Let's begin, if you will, with this statement. The Italian government firing back at Standard & Poor's, saying its decision to downgrade Rome's debt appears to have been, quote, dictated more by newspaper backchat than by reality, adding, it appears to have been polluted by political considerations. Grand Bishop, let me get your reaction to that statement from the Italian government.
Well, the fact is the credit rating agencies have a very serious problem because they have to respond to the facts. And all governments, all companies for that matter, whenever they're downgraded, they always say that the rating agency is doing it for some other reason. But the fact is there is bad news in Italy. There has been for a long time. And all these people they are the ambassador with a message, a rather uncomfortable message. But shooting the ambassador is simply not going to make the message go away. And this is where the Italian government under the Berlusconi government, has to get a grip of things and in good time, which it hasn't been doing, introduce appropriate budgets to bring its deficit down, as it has promised in the past, and to actually take the actions that mean that market participants and economists generally believe that there will be a reduction in their deficit. And sort of shilly-shallying in Parliament for weeks on end and changing their mind, etc., sends a very bad message about the political will to take tough and unpleasant medicine.
All right, that political will, if it's shimmy-shallying, as you say, it could also be because, and we'll see it now, ordinary citizens perhaps aren't too pleased about what's on offer.
Well, of course they aren't, but then they shouldn't have allowed their elected government to continue to run an unsound fiscal policy for many, many years. They've allowed the competitiveness of the Italian economy to deteriorate for years. That shouldn't have been the case. They've consistently voted for governments which have not taken the hard decisions, and eventually they run out of room, just as the Greeks have done. And they then have to take quickly some very unpalatable decisions.
All right, Frédéric Bonnevet.
I'd like to still stress the fact that the Italian plan is pretty severe. It's about 60 billion euros in total, which is far more than what other European governments have put in place. And besides, the Italian economy is pretty resilient still. Not in terms of growth, because everyone knows it's going to be pretty low for the coming years. But still, the structural deficit is below 3%. We would dream of that in France. And of course, debt may be high, standing at 120% of GDP. but that is backed by massive domestic savings. So I guess the Italian economy is not in such a bad shape. So I would say there is some truth to what the Berlusconi government says.
No, I think that on the Italian situation, what Standard & Poor's said is that we have a scenario, an economic scenario, which is the opposite of the government scenario. You know, when you look at figures from the government, they say, well, we will have an acceleration in growth in the 2-3 coming years. What Standard & Poor's said is that no, we will be at 0.7% for the from now to 2014. So it's the issue is from this divergent scenario. And the other point is that when you look at the Italian government plan, you realize that it's a little fuzzy, and you don't know exactly what are the details of the tax reform. And that's the first point. And the other point is that the government, we have a real issue on credibility, on government credibility, because when you look at the plan, they say we will have revenue. Part of revenue in our plan is 73%. Part of reducing expenses is 27%. This means that people can pay, and in that case, probably it's a bad calculation. It means that they don't want to reduce expenses because they don't want to fight with administration. So how can it be credible? You just say we have a very ambitious plan, so you will have to pay. Who can find this plan credible? Not Standard & Poor's.
All right, so some fuzzy math. Sunny Kapoor, again, we're talking about Europe's third largest economy. How much trouble is Europe in?
One line that sums it up is that unless Italian refinancing costs, borrowing costs, are brought down to sustainable levels, say close to the 4% range, all bets in Europe are off. The exposure of EU banks, in particular French banks, to the Italian economy is such that if doubts continue to linger over the solvency of Italy, which they will, if Italy is not able to reduce its refinancing costs, then basically the EU banking system is bankrupt. And, leave alone French AAA credit rating or even German one, we are basically facing economic Armageddon. So I would say that at this point, the single most important thing for all EU policymakers to focus on is how to bring down Italian borrowing costs. Yes, there are medium-term problems, there are other problems, there's Greece, but that is the single most important thing that everybody needs to focus on today.
Philippe Vechta, do you agree? Italy's more important than Greece and that Italy can bring down Europe?
Of course, and that's why we have this issue, okay, with Standard & Poor's, and we have to know how to manage this situation. We see that the European Central Bank intervene every week to buy Italian debt, and probably the solution, part of the solution, is to give more power to the European Central Bank in this issue and to accept a large transfer of risk from the private system, from the private banking, to the European Central Bank. The Bank of England, the Federal Reserve did large quantitative easing. We have to do exactly the same thing. We have to know how to manage that. Instead, we could manage and try to avoid high interest rates in Italy. But how can we do that? We have to change the mind of investors. We have to change the regulation we have in European system. And the role of the European Central Bank is at the top of the European issue. They have to buy bonds and on a very large scale. And to say it, they have to say we will buy 100, 200, 400 billion euro of Italian debt, and in that case, the risk we see on European banks will almost disappear, and that will change the picture in Europe.
All right, George Prevaloukis, your reaction to this? We're talking about a country with fuzzy math, where the politicians sort of go back and forth on what they promise. Does that remind you of perhaps, shall we say, Greece?
Yes, in a certain sense, but I think we have to differentiate the cases. And I'm afraid that many of the problems come from the fact that we bundle together very different cases. First of all, it's a question of scale. I mean, we say Greece and Italy, but the threat of Greece is much smaller because of its size. It's a small size. The exposure of the European banks is much smaller. Then the politics of Greece are very different, and the economy of Greece is very different in the sense that the Greek economy is much smaller, but also very open to the outside world. Let me just say that the Greek merchant marine is enormous, it's very big, much out of the scale of the country. Also, there is the Greek diaspora. So it's a very special case. It's also a very special case because of its politics, because I could say that Greece is, in a way, it might look very, very bizarre, but it's the last communist country. I mean, it has overgrown its public sector. What we have in front of us with the Greek crisis is almost something similar to the transition of the communist countries after the fall of communism.
All right, well, Philippe Vechtel was talking about changing mentalities in Italy. When it comes to changing mentalities in Greece, the last 48 hours have seen more high-pressure conference calls between the Greek government and donors, which the Greek government, by the way, responding with solemn pledges, which might be music to your ears, George Prevaloukis, like this one. Take a listen.
The country cannot go forward without the true implementation of major structural reforms. We have delayed them. We have delayed them, and now it is time we finish them.
George Prevaloukis, that's the right music to be playing, isn't it?
Well, the problem of the Greek government is not what they say, but whether they are credible in what they say. And I think the major problem is that they have lost all credibility after 2 years. For 2 years, they have been giving promises, and they have not been keeping those promises. So there is, I think, at present, a collapse of credibility, which means that, in my view, that there is a need of a new start. It's not possible to establish a credible strategy with such a vacuum of credibility.
All right, so there's need for political change. Let's get the reaction from Craig from Thessaloniki on the France 24 Debate Facebook page. He says, everyone, including myself, is worried about what the next day is going to bring, whether we'll have a job or enough money to pay the bills. Every time the government swears that the latest measures will be the last, they then announce another round. Graham Bishop, can the same be true for Europe? Every time that they swear that it's the last time that they're coming up with a bailout plan, it's not really.
Well, that's all. They haven't sworn it's the last time. On the contrary, the heads of government of the Eurozone regularly, at every one of their summit meetings, begin their communiques afterwards by saying they will do whatever it takes. And that is the problem. They haven't done that yet. If I could just go back to the comments about the ECB buying bonds, there is a limit to the point where if they buy a huge amount, they are taking on a credit risk, which is a political risk, which should properly be borne by the governments. And this is the collective government. And this is where, if you look at what the ECOFIN decided, the Council of Finance Ministers decided on Friday in Poland, they finally agreed the package, what's colloquially called the six-pack of economic governance measures. And I think this is extremely important because they have now said that if the Commission proposes something, it will go through unless the member states try and reverse it, which they will have difficulty. So we're now in the situation where the Commission will come up and make proposals together with sanctions. And if the member states agree with that, then I think it follows logically, but not yet economically and politically, that they ought to be willing to lend very large amounts of money to those governments who are in difficulty. And this is where the role of the EFSF is absolutely critical. It needs to be expanded drastically so they can lend €1 trillion, which is enough to deal with Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and a long way towards Italy. So that what we do know, as one of your people was saying, that Italian borrowing costs can then come back below or around about 4%. And at that stage, Italian government debt is sustainable, and so is Greek for that matter, at those interest rates. That's when the pressure is off the banking system because they're not facing huge losses. And that's when they won't be running into liquidity problems by companies or other banks withdrawing deposits. We're into a very vicious circle, which is a crisis of confidence. And I always quote Roosevelt in the 1930s, at the depth of the Depression in the US, all we have to fear is fear itself. This is where the politicians have now got to get ahead of the curve of the market and they've put in place all the various measures. Shortly they will have the legislative package ready for the EFSF to expand its powers. They've got to do that, and when they've got that, they have got to use it, and use it big and very quickly. That will turn this around very quickly.
Let's pick up on that point, Graham Bishop, because just a moment ago, George Prevlakis was saying how the current government in Greece doesn't have a mandate to go any further. Frédéric Bonnevet, I'm going to put the question to you. What in effect Graham Bishop is saying is that enhanced powers are in the works for that's what was decided among the finance ministers of the EU. But do they have the mandate to go ahead with this?
Well, they don't, but I guess we need to change that urgently, and we fully need to realize the fact that the true backstop for now really is monetary and not fiscal, i.e. the ECB in Frankfurt must, and I agree with Philippe Wester, must purchase more bonds, as it currently does with the securities markets program. Yet it's not sufficient. It buys around 10 to 14 billion euros worth of securities per week, but it must go beyond that, and it must not, and this is probably not what Graham Bishop referred to earlier on, it must not sterilize those purchases necessarily. But that is equivalent to changing its mandate and actually supporting growth.
So you have to go to the voters for something that huge, wouldn't you?
I guess you should not do that because we've wasted enough time. Everything that Europe does right now is precisely what the US did 2 years ago. We're running out of time. We urgently need to take some action.
You know, in May 2010, when the SMP program started at the ECB, they decided to do it. You know, they didn't ask her if they could change or something. You know, the situation is clearly an important. Now there is urgency on the situation. If we use the European Stabilization Fund, okay, but it's more. I find it's more complicated because in that case you ask Germany, you ask France, you ask Italy or other countries to guarantee the European fund. If you have the ECB can change its mandate and print money, and in that case the risk is spread on time, not currently.
All right,
I guess
we're going to have to take a quick break. We'll get back to this point. Hold that thought. Stay with us. The France 24 debate continues.